The rain came down in sheets over the industrial district of Ashwick, turning the cracked pavement into a mirror of gray sky and neon reflections. Elara Vance gripped her worn leather satchel tighter, the strap digging into the curve of her shoulder as she double-checked the address on her phone. The text message from the temp agency had been cryptic. Urgent mediation needed. High-profile clients. Confidential. 214. Blackthorn Lane. Ask for Mr. Cade. She'd almost deleted it. Community mediators didn't get calls for high-profile clients in the rusted-out guts of Ashwick. They got calls for neighborhood disputes, landlord-tenant squabbles, the occasional family inheritance meltdown. But the fee listed had been enough to cover 3 months of rent on her tiny apartment above the bakery, and Elara had learned long ago that pride didn't pay bills. So here she was, standing in front of a warehouse that looked more like a fortress than a place of business. The windows were blacked out, the steel door was reinforced, and 2 men in suits that fit too well stood on either side of the entrance, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses despite the gloom. One of them stepped forward, his hand raised. "Name," he said, not a question. "Elara Vance. I'm the mediator. I was sent by ID." She fumbled in her satchel, pulling out her driver's license. The man took it, glanced at it, then at her, his gaze lingering on the generous swell of her hips, the soft fullness of her belly beneath her best blazer, the roundness of her cheeks. His lip curled slightly, but he said nothing, just handed the license back and jerked his head toward the door. Inside, they're waiting. Elara straightened her spine, a move she'd perfected over years of being underestimated, in rooms full of people who thought size equaled weakness. She walked through the door, her sensible flat silent on the concrete floor. The interior was a shock of opulence against the industrial shell. Persian rugs covered the floor, a crystal chandelier hung from the exposed beams, and a long mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Around it sat 3 men, and the moment Elara saw them, her stomach dropped. She knew their faces. Everyone in Ashwick knew their faces, even if they pretended not to. The Volkov Bratva, the D'Angelo Syndicate, and the Kalin family, 3 mafia organizations that had carved the city into bloody pieces over the past decade. And there they were, the heads of each, sitting in a tense triangle of hostility. To her left, Dmitry Volkov, a mountain of a man, with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow and hands that could crush a skull. To her right, Marco D'Angelo, sleek and sharp in a charcoal suit, his smile a blade. And at the head of the table, Killian Kalin, the youngest of the 3, with copper hair and eyes the color of a frozen lake, his stillness more terrifying than any outburst. None of them looked happy to see her. "What the hell is this?" Dimitri's voice rumbled like distant thunder. He didn't even look at Elara, his glare fixed on a nervous-looking man hovering near the back of the room. A man Elara assumed was Mr. Cade, the one who'd sent for her. "The mediator you requested, Mr. Volkov," Cade stammered, wringing his hands. "Elara Vance. She's highly recommended for sensitive negotiations. I requested Elena." "Vance," Dmitry snarled, "the legal consultant who brokered the Geneva Accord. Not this." He finally turned his gaze on Elara, and it was like being hit with a wall of ice. "Who is this woman?" Elara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. She'd been in rooms where people dismissed her before. She'd been the fat girl in the corner, the one people overlooked, the one whose voice was ignored until she made it impossible to ignore. She planted her feet, feeling the solid weight of her body grounding her, and spoke. "My name is Elara Vance. I'm a community mediator. I specialize in conflict resolution, de-escalation, and restorative justice. I was sent by the agency because your assistant, Mr. Cade, made an error in the request. But I'm here now, and I'm prepared to help." Marco D'Angelo laughed. It was a sharp, delighted sound, like a knife scraping bone. "Restorative justice. Is that what they're calling it now? Tell me, Miss Vance, have you ever restored justice between two men who want to put bullets in each other's skulls? I've mediated gang disputes, domestic violence cases, and community crises that could have turned into bloodbaths," Elara said, her voice steady. "Conflict is conflict. The weapons change, but the wounds are the same." Cillian Kalen hadn't spoken. He just watched her, those frozen lake eyes unblinking. There was something in his gaze that made Elara's skin prickle. Not fear, exactly, but a hyper-awareness, like standing too close to a cliff edge. He was the youngest of the three, maybe early 30s, but he carried himself with a weight that made the others seem like posturing boys. "You're wasting our time," Dimitri said, pushing back from the table. "Cade, get her out of here. Find the real Vance. We don't have time for—" "You're fighting about a woman," Elara said. The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that happens when people stop talking, but the kind that happens when the air itself freezes. Dimitri's hand, halfway to his gun, stopped. Marco's smile vanished. And Killian's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, but it was the most reaction she'd seen from him. "What did you say?" Dimitri's voice was dangerously low. Elara's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to breathe. She'd seen the signs the moment she walked in. The way Dimitri's fists clenched when he looked at Cillian. The way Marco's smirk didn't reach his eyes when he glanced at Dimitri. The photograph on the table, half hidden under a map of the city's territories. A photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a familiar smile. "I said you're fighting about a woman," Elara repeated. "Not territory, not power, not business. There's a personal wound here, something that's been festering for years. I can see it in the way you look at each other. This isn't a negotiation. This is a funeral that never happened." Marco leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You got all that from a photograph?" "I got it from the fact that none of you have mentioned the docks, the shipments, or the border disputes that the papers say you're fighting over," Elara said. "You've been in this room for at least an hour before I arrived, and the only thing on this table that looks touched is that photograph. The map is pristine. The contracts are unopened. But that picture has fingerprints all over it." Dimitri's jaw tightened. He looked at Cillian, and for a moment, the mask of the brutal Mafia boss slipped, revealing something raw and agonized beneath. "She doesn't know what she's talking about. Don't I?" Elara stepped closer to the table, her satchel still clutched to her chest like a shield. "I've spent 10 years listening to people scream at each other. I've sat in kitchens where husbands and wives threw plates at each other's heads. I've stood between rival gang members who wanted to carve each other up with broken bottles. And in every single case, the thing they were fighting about wasn't the thing they were really fighting about. So tell me, Mr. Volkov, who is she? The woman in the photograph. Who is she to you?" The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then Cillian spoke, his voice soft and cold as falling snow. "Her name was Saoirse. She was my sister." Elara turned to him, and the pain in his eyes was so sudden, so unexpected, that it stole her breath. He wasn't looking at her, though. He was looking at Dimitri. "And he killed her." Dimitri slammed his fist on the table, the sound like a gunshot. "I didn't kill her. I loved her. You're the one who abandoned her when she needed you most." "I abandoned her." Cillian rose from his chair, and suddenly the room felt too small, the air too thin. "You were the one who promised to protect her. You were the one who swore on your life that no harm would come to her. And then you left her alone in that apartment, while you went to settle a score. And when you came back, she was gone. She wasn't gone. She was taken by his people. Dmitri pointed at Marco, who had gone very still. Marco raised his hands, a gesture of innocence that fooled no one. I had nothing to do with Saoirse's disappearance. She was like a sister to me. A sister you tried to marry off to your cousin, Killian spat. To protect her from... Marco jabbed a finger at Dmitri. Everyone knew the Volkovs had a target on their backs. I was trying to get her out of the line of fire. By forcing her into a marriage she didn't want, it was better than letting her die. The three of them were on their feet now, shouting over each other, years of grief and guilt and rage pouring out in a torrent. Elara watched them, her heart aching with the weight of it. This wasn't a mafia war. This was a family, shattered by loss, each of them blaming the others for a tragedy none of them could undo. And then she saw it, the thing beneath the anger, the thing they weren't saying. You all loved her, Elara said, and her voice cut through the chaos like a bell. You all loved her, and you all failed her, and you can't forgive yourselves. So you're trying to make each other pay for it. The shouting stopped. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her, and in them she saw shock, fury, and something else, something that looked almost like hope. You don't know anything, Dmitri said, but his voice cracked on the last word. I know that grief is a wound that doesn't heal unless you let it, Elara said. I know that blame is easier than mourning, and I know that if you keep going down this road, more people are going to die. People who had nothing to do with Saoirse. People who have families of their own. What do you suggest? Cillian asked, and there was a dangerous edge to his voice, a challenge. That we just forgive each other, shake hands and walk away? No, Elara said. I suggest you find out what really happened to her. Marco frowned. We know what happened. She was killed in the crossfire of a turf war. Do you have a body? The question hung in the air, ugly and raw. Dmitri flinched. Killian's hands curled into fists. Marco looked away. No, Cillian said finally. There was no body. Just blood. And her necklace. Then you don't know she's dead, Elara said. You've been fighting a war based on an assumption. A terrible, painful assumption. But an assumption nonetheless. What if she's still alive? What if she left because she couldn't bear to watch you destroy each other? That's impossible, Dmitri said, but his voice was uncertain now. Is it? Elara reached into her satchel and pulled out a worn notebook, the one she used for her cases. I've seen families torn apart by less. I've seen people disappear because the weight of the conflict was too much to bear. If Saoirse was as loved as you say, maybe she couldn't stand to be the reason for so much pain. Killian sank back into his chair, his face pale. You're saying she might have run away? I'm saying you owe it to her to find out the truth before you burn the city down. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain hammered against the roof, a steady drumbeat that filled the silence. Then Marco let out a shaky breath. There's someone who might know, he said. An old woman. She raised us, all 3 of us, and Saoirse too. She's the only one who knew everything. Sister Margaret, Dmitri said, and the name was a prayer on his lips. She's still alive? She's at St. Agnes's, Marco said, the chapel on the east side. She's been there for years. I send money to keep the place running, but I haven't visited. I couldn't face her. Cillian looked at Elara, and there was something new in his gaze. Respect, maybe, or curiosity, or something deeper and more dangerous. You want to mediate this? Then come with us. Talk to Sister Margaret. Help us find the truth. It wasn't a request. It was a command, wrapped in the velvet of his voice. Elara knew she should say no. She should walk out of this warehouse and never look back. She was a community mediator, not a mafia therapist. But she thought of the photograph on the table, the young woman with the dark hair and the familiar smile, and she thought of all the people who would die if this war continued. "Fine," she said, "but we do this my way. No guns, no threats. We go to the chapel, and we listen, really listen. Can you do that?" The three mafia bosses exchanged glances. It was almost comical, seeing these dangerous, powerful men look at each other like schoolboys caught in a lie. Then Dmitri nodded, a short, sharp jerk of his chin. "No guns," he agreed. "No threats," Marco added. Killian just looked at her, his frozen lake eyes thawing just a little. "Lead the way, Miss Vance." The drive to St. Agnes's was tense and silent. Elara sat in the back of a black SUV, sandwiched between Dimitri's bulk and Marco's sleekness, while Killian rode in the front, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. The city blurred past, gray and wet, and Elara found herself thinking about her own past, the years of being overlooked, the clients who had dismissed her because of her size, the quiet satisfaction of proving them wrong. She'd never imagined she'd be proving herself to mafia bosses, but here she was. St. Agnes's was a small stone chapel tucked between a laundromat and a boarded-up bakery. The stained glass windows were cracked, the garden overgrown, but a light burned in the vestibule, warm and welcoming. As they pulled up, Elara saw a figure in the doorway, an old woman in a nun's habit, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp and clear. Sister Margaret. She didn't look surprised to see them. She looked like she'd been expecting them for years. "Come in," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I've been praying for this day." The chapel smelled of incense and old wood. Candles flickered on the altar, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sister Margaret led them to a small room off the nave, furnished with a worn sofa and a few chairs. She gestured for them to sit, and they did, the three mafia bosses looking oddly diminished in the humble space. "You've come about Saoirse," Sister Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "You know where she is." Killian's voice was raw. The old nun sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "I know everything. I've been waiting for you to ask." She told them a story that shattered everything they thought they knew. Saoirse hadn't been killed in a turf war. She hadn't been taken by rivals. She had run away, but not because she was afraid. She had run away because she was pregnant. "Pregnant?" Dimitri's face went white. "With whose child?" "Yours," Sister Margaret said gently. "She found out a week before she disappeared. She was going to tell you, but then the shooting started, the war between your families, and she panicked. She thought if she stayed, the baby would be a target. So she came to me. I helped her leave the city. I gave her money, a new identity, a place to go." "Where is she now?" Killian demanded. "She's safe," Sister Margaret said. "She's been safe for 10 years. She has a daughter, your daughter, Dimitri, a beautiful girl named Aisling. They live in a small town up north, far away from all this violence." Dimitri made a sound like a wounded animal. He buried his face in his hands, his massive shoulders shaking. Marco stared at the floor, his expression unreadable. And Cillian looked at Elara, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart stutter. "You were right," he said. "She's alive. You can see her," Sister Margaret said. "She wants to see you, all of you. But she made me promise not to tell you until you were ready to end this war, until you were ready to be a family again." "A family," Marco repeated, and there was a bitter edge to his voice. "We've spent 10 years trying to kill each other. How do we come back from that?" "You start by forgiving yourselves," Elara said, "and each other. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. But if you want to see Saoirse, if you want to meet your daughter, Dimitri, you have to try." The room fell silent. Then Dmitri lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I want to see her. I want to see my daughter." "So do I," Killian said. "And I," Marco added quietly. Sister Margaret smiled, a beatific expression that transformed her weathered face. "Then I'll make the call." As she rose and left the room, Elara felt the tension in the air shift. It wasn't gone. There was too much history, too much pain for that. But it was different, lighter. The three men looked at each other, and for the first time, there was no hatred in their eyes, just exhaustion and grief and a fragile, tentative hope. "You did this," Killian said to Elara, his voice low. "You walked into a room full of killers, and you stopped a war with words." "I just listened," Elara said. "That's all anyone ever really needs. Someone to listen." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze tracing the curves of her face, the softness of her body, the strength in her posture. "You're remarkable, Miss Vance. I'm just a mediator." "No," he said, and there was a heat in his voice that made her pulse quicken. "You're much more than that." The days that followed were a blur of negotiations and revelations. Sister Margaret arranged a meeting with Saoirse, and the reunion was everything Elara had hoped for and more. Saoirse was now a quiet, strong woman, with silver streaks in her dark hair, and her daughter Aisling was a bright-eyed 10-year-old who looked exactly like Dmitri. When Dmitri saw her, he fell to his knees and wept, and Aisling, after a moment of hesitation, walked over and put her small hand on his cheek. "You're my daddy," she said, not a question. "Yes," Dmitri choked out. "I'm your daddy." The war didn't end overnight. There were still territorial disputes to settle, alliances to renegotiate, and years of bad blood to address. But with Saoirse's return, the core wound had been healed, and the three families began the slow, painful process of reconciliation. Elara stayed on as a mediator, helping them navigate the treacherous waters of peace. She became a fixture in their world, a calm, steady presence that even the most hardened soldiers came to respect. And Killian Kaelin became something else entirely. He started showing up at her apartment above the bakery, always with a pretext, a question about a negotiation, an update on the peace talks, a book he thought she might like. He brought her coffee from the cafe down the street, remembered how she took it, oat milk, no sugar, and lingered in her doorway longer than necessary. His frozen lake eyes thawed whenever he looked at her, and his voice, so cold and commanding in the warehouse, became soft and almost hesitant. "You're courting me," Elara said one evening, after he'd shown up with a bouquet of wildflowers and a bottle of wine. Killian's ears turned pink, a sight that would have shocked his enemies. "Is it that obvious? You're a Mafia boss. Subtlety isn't your strong suit." He laughed, a rare, genuine sound that made her stomach flutter. "I've never met anyone like you, Elara. You walked into a room full of men who could have killed you, and you didn't flinch. You looked at us, really looked, and you saw the pain we were hiding. No one has ever done that before." "I just did my job." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You did something no one else could. You saved us. You saved my sister. You saved my niece. And you did it without raising your voice or drawing a weapon. You're the most dangerous person I've ever met, Elara Vance, because you have the power to disarm anyone with nothing but your words." She should have been afraid. She should have pushed him away, reminded him that she was a community mediator from a working-class neighborhood, that she didn't belong in his world of violence and power. But when he looked at her like that, like she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen, she couldn't remember why any of that mattered. "What do you want from me, Cillian?" "Everything," he said, and the word was a vow. "I want to know you. I want to understand how your mind works. I want to sit in your tiny apartment and listen to you talk about conflict resolution and restorative justice until the sun comes up. I want to protect you from anyone who ever makes you feel less than the extraordinary woman you are. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of standing beside you. Elara's heart was pounding so hard, she was sure he could hear it. That's a lot of wanting. I'm a patient man, he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. I'll wait as long as it takes. She didn't make him wait long. The first time he kissed her, it was in the chapel, where the old betrayal had begun. They had gone there for a memorial service for the lives lost in the war, a somber occasion attended by all three families. After the service, as the others filed out, Killian had taken her hand and led her to the garden, where the overgrown roses were just beginning to bloom. I used to come here as a child, he said. Sister Margaret would give me cookies and tell me stories about saints. I thought it was the safest place in the world. And now? Now I think the safest place in the world is wherever you are. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, his hands cradling her face like she was made of glass. Elara had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such tenderness, such awe. She melted into him, her curves pressing against the hard planes of his body, and for the first time in her life, she felt not just accepted, but cherished. I love you, he whispered against her lips. I know it's fast, and I know we're from different worlds, but I don't care. I love you, Elara. I love you too, she said, and the words felt like coming home. Their relationship wasn't easy. There were still dangers in Killian's world. Rivals who saw his newfound peace as weakness. Enemies who wanted to drag the families back into war. But Elara was no longer just a mediator. She was a partner, a strategist, a woman who had earned the respect of 3 Mafia organizations. She used her skills to help Cillian navigate the treacherous politics of the underworld, and he used his power to protect her from anyone who threatened her. One night, a rival faction tried to kidnap her, hoping to use her as leverage against Killian. They grabbed her outside the bakery, dragging her into a van before she could scream. But Elara didn't panic. She'd spent years de-escalating violent situations, and she used every trick she knew to keep her captors off balance, asking questions, finding the cracks in their resolve, planting seeds of doubt. By the time Killian's men found the van, she had talked 2 of the kidnappers into surrendering and convinced the 3rd to give up his boss's location. Killian was furious and terrified in equal measure. He held her so tightly that night that she thought he might never let go. I can't lose you, he said, his voice breaking. You're the only good thing in my life, the only pure thing. If anything happened to you, nothing's going to happen to me, Elara said, stroking his hair. I'm not going anywhere. Marry me, he said suddenly, pulling back to look at her. I know it's insane. I know we've only known each other for a few months, but I don't want to wait. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build a life with you, away from all this violence. I want to be the man you deserve. Elara stared at him, her heart swelling with so much emotion she thought it might burst. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. The wedding was held at St. Agnes's, with Sister Margaret officiating and Sorsha as the maid of honor. Dimitri and Marco stood as Killian's groomsmen, a sight that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Aisling scattered flower petals down the aisle, her laughter ringing through the chapel like bells. And Elara walked toward her future, her curves draped in ivory lace, her head held high, her heart full. As she reached the altar, Cillian took her hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears. You saved me, he said, so quietly that only she could hear. You saved all of us. We saved each other, Elara said. And when they kissed, the chapel erupted in applause, not just from the guests, but from the ghosts of the past, finally laid to rest. In the years that followed, the three families became something unprecedented in the criminal underworld. A true alliance, bound not just by business, but by blood and love. Elara continued her work as a mediator, expanding her practice to help other communities torn apart by violence. Cillian slowly stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the Kalen family, delegating more to his trusted lieutenants so he could spend time with his wife and their eventual children, 2 daughters, both of whom inherited their mother's sharp mind and their father's fierce protectiveness. Dmitri became a devoted father to Aisling, and though he and Sorsha never rekindled their romantic relationship, they built a strong co-parenting partnership that healed old wounds. Marco, who had always been the most cynical of the three, found unexpected joy in being an uncle to all the children, spoiling them rotten and teaching them card tricks. And Sister Margaret, the quiet nun who had held the secret for so long, passed away peacefully in her sleep a few years after the wedding, knowing that her prayers had been answered. Elara often thought about that rainy night in the warehouse, when she'd walked into a room full of killers and refused to be afraid. She'd been underestimated her whole life, because of her size, her gender, her profession. But that night, she'd discovered a truth that had carried her through every challenge since. Strength isn't about how loud you shout or how hard you hit. It's about how deeply you listen, how bravely you love, and how fiercely you believe that even the most broken people can be healed. And as she stood on the balcony of the home she shared with Cillian, watching the sun set over Ashwick, she felt a profound sense of peace. The war was over, the wounds were healing, and she, Elara Vance, the plus-size mediator who had been laughed out of a room, had become the most powerful woman in the city, not through violence, but through the quiet, unstoppable force of empathy. Cillian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "How lucky I am," she said. "How different things could have been." "They're not different," he said. "They're exactly as they should be, because of you." She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had once been her enemy and was now her everything. "I love you, Cillian Kalen. I love you too, Elara Vance," he said. "My mediator, my miracle, my heart." And as the city lights flickered on below them, they stood together, 2 people from different worlds who had found each other in the chaos and built something beautiful from the ashes.